For Cliff Richard, love was never a tabloid scandal. It was a private ache that quietly shaped the course of his life. He never married. He never had children. Yet for decades he was seen as the clean-cut idol who had it all. But behind that carefully guarded smile was the kind of heartbreak that doesn't fade. It settles into your bones. It began in 1971, when Cliff invited a rising Australian singer named Olivia Newton John to perform on his TV variety show. She was 22, bright-eyed, velvet-voiced, and unknown in Britain. Cliff knew instantly, this wasn't just talent. She had something deeper. "I knew right away," he later confessed, "she was a friend for life." But the truth, as he would admit much later, was more complicated. He had fallen for her. The timing was cruel. Olivia was already engaged, and not to a stranger, to Bruce Welch, Cliff's longtime bandmate from the Shadows. The same man who had helped craft some of Cliff's biggest hits. Their affair was intense, public, and ultimately doomed. But during those years, Cliff stayed silent. He respected the boundaries, never interfered, never confessed. Even when Olivia and Bruce split in 1973, an ugly breakup that left Bruce devastated and rumors swirling, Cliff remained quiet. Some whispered that Olivia had fallen for Cliff. Others speculated that he had kept his distance to protect both friendships. But Cliff never explained, never clarified. Instead, he carried that love like a secret song, never performed, never recorded. What's remarkable is how close they stayed. For over 40 years, Cliff and Olivia remained creative partners, confidants, and co-stars. Their voices blended with an ease that made fans suspect there was something more. When they sang Suddenly in 1980, the emotion felt real. Too real. It was the sound of a connection that never found a name. In his 2020 autobiography, Cliff finally opened the door just a crack. "When I, and many of us, were in love with Olivia, she was engaged to someone else. I lost my chance." He wrote it not as a bitter man, but as someone still carrying the weight of what might have been. He called her graceful and untouchable. And perhaps she was. Their final duet came in 2015 at the Royal Albert Hall. Cliff was turning 75. Olivia flew in to surprise him. They sang Suddenly one last time. The audience cheered, unaware that this would be their farewell. 3 weeks before she died, Cliff called her. She answered with her usual warmth. "Good day, Cliff. How are you, darling?" She never sounded sick. Never let on. That phone call was the end of a love story that had never truly begun. When she passed in 2022, Cliff's grief was raw. He didn't say she died. He said she had simply stopped living. Before he was Cliff Richard, before the stadiums, the silver discs, or the scandals, he was Harry Roger Webb. And from the moment he was born, the world around him was already splitting at the seams. It was October 14th, 1940, the middle of World War II. In King George's Hospital in Lucknow, British India, Harry entered a world lit by the fires of war and revolution. Bombs were falling in Europe. German U-boats haunted the Atlantic. And in India, the colonial order that had defined generations of British rule was on the verge of collapse. His father, Roger Webb, worked in the catering division of Indian Railways, a job that afforded them comfort and status in the British colonial system. For the first few years of his life, young Harry lived in relative ease. Open verandas, a house with servants, and a childhood framed by privilege, until the world changed. By 1946, British India was a boiling pot. The Calcutta riots, also known as Direct Action Day, turned city streets into battlegrounds. What had once been whispers of independence was now a roar. The British were leaving, and they were leaving quickly. Families like the Webbs were told to pack what they could and evacuate. And so in 1948, the Webbs did exactly that. Boarding the SS Ranchi, a rusting passenger ship crowded with British expatriates fleeing a country they had once ruled. That voyage was slow and strange. For 3 weeks, Harry watched the familiar fade into horizon, India disappearing into memory, replaced by the cold unknown of post-war England. When the ship finally docked, it was not in the empire they had once represented, but in a battered, rationed nation still limping out of the Second World War. England was grey, cold, and quiet. The grandeur of India gave way to the small, cramped house in Carshalton, Surrey, where every meal was counted and every comfort questioned. Gone were the sweeping heat and soft nights. In their place, damp corridors, chilly mornings, and a country still rationing sugar and soap. It was a harsh transition for a boy who had known a different life entirely. But it was also a beginning. The war, the voyage, the loss of one home, and the unease of another. These weren't just hardships. They were chapters in a larger transformation. A boy named Harry, disoriented and out of place, began learning how to adapt, how to bend without breaking, how to keep moving, even when the world seemed to have none of the answers. It was in that struggle, in that cultural no-man's land between two collapsing identities, that the seeds of something else were planted. Not yet a singer, not yet a star, but a young boy trying to find his footing in a place that never really felt like home. And it's there, among ration books, secondhand shoes, and borrowed pride, that Harry Webb began to disappear. Because the world would soon meet someone else entirely, Cliff Richard. To understand what Cliff Richard did in 1958, you have to understand what didn't exist yet. There was no British rock and roll scene, no cultural machinery to support it. The charts were dominated by American imports, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, while British singers mostly mimicked, softly crooned, or stayed safely within the confines of easy-listening tunes designed for parents more than their teenage children. British teenagers had no musical identity of their own. And then came a boy with a quiff, a cheap guitar, and a sound that didn't ask for permission. Cliff Richard, born Harry Roger Webb, wasn't from money or from the streets. He came from the disorientation of post-empire exile, from the awkward space between colonial comfort and post-war austerity. Maybe that's what gave him his edge. He didn't sound like someone trying to copy America. He sounded like someone trying to scream over the silence Britain had become used to. It started with an audition. In 1958, Cliff recorded a cover of Schoolboy Crush, a sugary pop tune, because that's what record execs expected. But the B-side was different, a raw, growling song called Move It. Penned by Ian Samwell and inspired by the pulse of real teenage life, Move It had no strings, no choirs, no showbiz gloss, just rhythm, defiance, and a teenager's heart in freefall. When BBC Radio's Jack Good heard it, he immediately knew it was special. "This is the real thing," he said. "This isn't just another imitation of Elvis." Good flipped the single, playing Move It on air instead of the planned A-side. That one moment flipped Cliff Richard's life as well. Move It entered the UK charts at number 16. It soared to number 2, and with that, Cliff became the first British rock artist to break into the top 3 with an original homegrown rock track. No one had done it before. Not Tommy Steele, not Marty Wilde. Cliff wasn't just entering the race, he was building the track. But success didn't just come through sound, it came through presence. When Cliff walked on stage, he didn't stand still and smile politely. He moved. He curled his lip. He danced with his mic stand. To a generation raised on stiff dance halls and BBC announcers, it was revolutionary. It was Elvis, but it was British. And the reaction was electric. Teenage girls screamed until their voices cracked. Boys either copied his hairstyle or hated him for commanding the attention of every girl in town. Venues across the country began hiring extra security. Police started treating concerts like potential riots. This wasn't just fandom. This was mania, and it had never happened in Britain before. That year, his backing band, the Drifters, soon renamed the Shadows, were quickly becoming rock legends themselves. Together, they weren't just performing hits. They were laying the foundation for the UK's rock revolution. By 1959, Cliff had become a household name. He was 18 years old. He was releasing hit after hit. Living Doll, a song he originally hated, was reworked into a smooth, country-style ballad that hit number 1 and stayed there for 6 weeks. It sold 770,000 copies in Britain alone and earned him his first silver disc by November. By January, it had gone gold. Then came Travelin' Light, another number 1, another 5 weeks at the top. Between those two songs, Cliff had sold over 1 million records in Britain before he turned 20. No one in the UK had done that. Not Frank Ifield, not Lonnie Donegan, not even Elvis, not in Britain. But Cliff wasn't just dominating the music charts, he was reshaping what British pop could be. Before Cliff, British teenagers consumed culture from abroad. After Cliff, they had someone of their own. Someone who didn't wear a tuxedo on stage. Someone who didn't sound like their parents' generation. Someone who didn't apologize for being young, fast, and loud. He wasn't copying America. He was giving Britain a voice it didn't even realize it had been missing. And this wasn't a one-off success. Cliff's early hits, High Class Baby, Mean Streak, A Voice in the Wilderness, all climbed the charts, pulling the UK further and further into a new sonic world. In the space of a year, he'd gone from unknown teenager to cultural firestarter. But Cliff wasn't just leading a musical shift. He was commanding an emotional one. His fans weren't just buying records, they were devoting themselves. Cliff became a figure of devotion, equal parts rock rebel and clean-cut dream. For older generations, he was palatable enough to not be terrifying. For teenagers, he was dangerous enough to be exciting. Cliff Richard had invented something that didn't exist before: British youth culture in stereo. And though the world hadn't yet heard of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, or David Bowie, every one of them would later point back to this moment, to that name, to that song. Before there was a British invasion, there was Move It. And at the center of it all was a boy named Cliff Richard, the one who made British rock real. By the time most pop stars get a movie deal, they're already being marketed as products. But Cliff Richard didn't wait to be packaged. He took the reins himself. While still a teenager, Cliff realized something vital. If he wanted to outlast the hype, he needed to be more than a singer. He needed to become a storyteller, a screen presence, a brand. And that meant film. His cinematic journey began with an unexpected choice. Serious Charge, 1959, wasn't the kind of upbeat, glamorous role that other pop stars might have chosen. It was bleak. The story centered on a vicar falsely accused of sexual misconduct by a troubled youth played by Cliff. He wasn't even the lead role, but his performance was chilling and raw, showing a depth far beyond his age. The subject matter was bold for the era, and Cliff's willingness to attach himself to a project that challenged social norms set the tone for the kind of artist he was determined to be. One who took risks, even when he didn't have to. That same year, Cliff starred in Espresso Bongo, and this time he stepped closer to the center. The film was biting, witty, and surprisingly cynical about the very music industry Cliff was thriving in. He played a fictional version of himself, manipulated, marketed, and molded by greedy managers and press agents. It was a satire, yes, but also a glimpse behind the glitter. Once again, Cliff showed audiences he wasn't afraid to critique the system that made him famous. The result? Film producers and fans began to take him seriously. By the early 1960s, British cinema was in need of a fresh youth icon, someone who could carry a film and sell the soundtrack. Cliff was that icon. But he wasn't content with being a studio puppet. He wanted to craft experiences, not just perform in them. That's where The Young Ones, 1961, changed everything. The plot was simple. Teenagers band together to save their youth club from greedy developers. But the film's energy was electric. It combined idealism, rebellion, and musical optimism in a way that resonated across Britain's post-war youth. Cliff was charming, confident, and utterly believable, not just as a singer, but as a character with purpose. The soundtrack featured hits like When the Girl in Your Arms is the Girl in Your Heart and The Young Ones, which sold over 1 million copies and spent 6 weeks at #1. It wasn't just a hit. It was a generational moment. Cliff was no longer just a pop idol, he was a movement. Then, at the height of his stardom, came Summer Holiday, 1963. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more crucial. The Beatles were just beginning to creep into public consciousness. The cultural mood was shifting. Cliff needed to evolve or risk being overtaken. And evolve he did. Summer Holiday was an explosion of color and sunshine. A group of young Londoners convert a double-decker bus and travel through Europe on a quest for adventure and love. The film was lighthearted, romantic, and full of infectious optimism. Cliff wasn't just acting. He was leading a generation out of the black and white shadow of the 1950s into something brighter. And audiences felt it. On the night of the premiere, Leicester Square overflowed with fans. Police barriers buckled, crowds pressed against the windows. Cliff couldn't even make it into the theater. But the energy outside said it all. He had become more than a performer. He was the face of youth itself. The Summer Holiday soundtrack was a cultural phenomenon. It didn't just top the charts, it owned them, staying at #1 for 14 consecutive weeks. 4 of its songs, including The Next Time, Bachelor Boy, and Summer Holiday itself, became massive hits. Even the instrumental track Foot Tapper, performed by The Shadows, went to number 1. The movie grossed over £500,000 at the British box office, an enormous sum at the time. It became the second highest-grossing film of the year, outpaced only by From Russia with Love, a James Bond film. That was the league Cliff was now operating in, not just pop stars, but cinematic icons. What's often forgotten today is how unique this success was. British pop stars didn't lead box office hits. They sang. They toured. But Cliff changed that. His films proved that a music career didn't have to be fleeting. It could evolve. It could become legacy. In 1963, Motion Picture Herald named him Britain's most popular male film star, above Roger Moore, above Peter Sellers, even above Sean Connery. And while critics didn't always give him the praise he deserved, the box office numbers didn't lie. Cliff Richard had become the first and only British pop musician to conquer both the charts and the cinema with equal force. But even more remarkable was his ability to do all this before the cultural tidal wave of the Beatles truly hit. People often assume that Cliff faded when the Beatles rose, but in reality, he was dominating charts and box offices before John and Paul had even cracked the mainstream. Cliff didn't chase trends. He didn't mimic others. He set the pace, and for a while, no one could keep up. Before A Hard Day's Night, before Beatlemania swept the globe, British teenagers had already seen their first musical movie star. He wasn't just singing about holidays, he was taking the entire country on one. And they weren't ready for it to end. Cliff Richard had always stood out, but in 1966, he didn't just stand out, he stood apart. In the middle of the most permissive, boundary-breaking decade Britain had ever known, when the rules of pop culture were being rewritten nightly in smoky Soho clubs and Carnaby Street boutiques, Cliff made a move that stunned fans, baffled industry insiders, and confused almost everyone except himself. He publicly declared his faith. The moment was monumental, not just because of what he said, but because of who was saying it. Cliff wasn't some fading pop star seeking reinvention. He was still charting hits, still packing theaters, still seen as the gold standard of British entertainment. But when he walked onto the stage at Earl's Court in June 1966, beside American evangelist Billy Graham, and shared that he had become a born-again Christian, the ripple effect reached far beyond the crowd in that arena. Cliff didn't hedge his words. He didn't soften them for commercial safety. This was not a media strategy. It was a spiritual milestone, a decision he had reached privately 2 years earlier, after wrestling with doubt, fame, and the gnawing question of whether success could really fill the void he felt inside. In the weeks that followed, the press didn't know what to do with the story. Some outlets treated it like a joke, others tried to downplay it. But his fans couldn't ignore it. This was the man who had introduced rock and roll to Britain, who had made teenagers scream and record labels rich. Now he was quoting scripture, attending prayer meetings, and talking about Jesus on national television. It defied the narrative. Pop stars were supposed to push the boundaries of society. Cliff was embracing discipline. Artists were supposed to mock tradition. Cliff was leaning into truth. In an era of LSD and sexual liberation, Cliff was talking about abstinence, self-control, and the afterlife. And the reaction was mixed. Some fans felt betrayed, as though he'd abandoned the image they had come to adore. The cool, confident rebel with a guitar and a wink. Critics called it a midlife crisis in slow motion. Radio stations hesitated to play his newer tracks. Some managers and producers advised him to keep his beliefs behind the scenes. Don't alienate the audience. Don't preach. Don't change the winning formula. But Cliff didn't flinch. He wasn't interested in shrinking into some spiritual niche or turning into a religious figurehead. He simply wanted to be honest. He wanted to live without contradiction, to sing the songs he believed in, to act with moral clarity, and to finally drop the performance that had never really fit him. Years later, he would admit that his early rock and roll persona, the hip-shaking, brooding heartthrob, was a costume. I wasn't confident, he said. I was pretending. But faith gave him something different, something sturdier, a sense of self that wasn't dependent on applause. I felt liberated, he once told an interviewer. The pressure to be something I wasn't just disappeared. It was a shift not just in belief, but in purpose. Instead of fading from the spotlight, Cliff found new ways to shine. He recorded songs with subtle spiritual messages, not preaching, but nudging. Tracks like Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music, or Better Than I Know Myself hinted at his internal transformation. They didn't top the charts the way Living Doll had, but they mattered to him. And slowly they began to matter to his fans, too. What Cliff did in those years was quietly revolutionary. He challenged the idea that faith and fame were incompatible. That belief in God meant giving up success. That a pop star had to choose between their platform and their conscience. He chose both. And in doing so, he redefined what longevity looked like in the music world. Not as a constant reinvention of image, but as a deeper commitment to identity. He also found a new audience. People who had never felt seen by the rock world. Christians who loved music but didn't connect with the culture around it. Older fans who had grown up with Cliff and appreciated his honesty. And even young listeners who were just beginning to ask the big questions themselves. But Cliff never called himself a religious singer. That label didn't fit him any more than the rock rebel costume had. He was just being real. Of course, some opportunities disappeared. Certain radio stations dropped him. TV producers quietly passed him over. Record execs sometimes pushed younger, edgier acts. But Cliff never compromised. And the strange thing, his popularity didn't die. In fact, it remained stubbornly strong. Because while the culture was obsessed with reinvention, Cliff stood for something that didn't shift with the seasons. In a world that was constantly changing, he became a rare symbol of consistency. He didn't just tell people what he believed. He lived it. And over time, people noticed. Not because he was loud, but because he was unchanging, unshakable. Faithful to his values, to his audience, and most of all to the person he had finally allowed himself to become. Cliff Richard didn't find God in the spotlight. He found God away from it. But when he returned to that stage, he didn't leave his faith in the dressing room. He brought it with him, and Britain had never seen anything like it. The mid-1970s were a turning point for British music. Louder, wilder, more extreme. Glam was burning bright, punk was bubbling under the surface, and disco was sweeping across dance floors. For many, the cultural compass had swung so far that there was no room left for someone like Cliff Richard. He wasn't dangerous enough, not ironic enough, not weird or rebellious. He was too clean, too polished, too Cliff. To the press, he was already filed under yesterday's hero. And to younger audiences, he was a name their parents liked. A face they remembered vaguely from old black and white movies and Christmas specials. His last few singles had failed to chart. His sound was considered dated. Even his long-held Christian faith, once a quiet revolution, now seemed more like a barrier in an industry chasing edge. It would have been easy to step away, quietly, gracefully. But that's not what Cliff Richard did. Instead, he walked back into the studio and recorded a song that was darker, sexier, and more emotionally complex than anything he'd ever released. Devil Woman was an eerie, haunting track about being lured in by a mysterious fortune teller. "She's gonna get you," the chorus warned, and its tone was anything but sweet. The guitars snarled, the rhythm pulsed, and Cliff? He didn't sound like a man clinging to fame. He sounded like a man reborn. When the song dropped in 1976, even his record label wasn't sure what to expect. Would longtime fans accept this new, brooding version of Cliff? Would radio stations play it? The answers came quickly. Devil Woman was a hit. It shot up to number 9 in the UK, giving Cliff his first top 10 in years. But even more remarkable was what happened next. It broke into the US top 10, climbing to number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. After nearly 2 decades of being seen as too British or too soft for American audiences, Cliff Richard, at age 35, was suddenly getting played alongside Fleetwood Mac, Queen, and David Bowie. This wasn't nostalgia, this was relevance. And then the unthinkable happened. The rock establishment paid attention. The same musicians who once represented the evolution beyond Cliff, men who'd grown up idolizing Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and yes, even Cliff himself, began showing up to gigs wearing "I'm Nearly Famous" badges, the title of his new album. Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Elton John. These weren't B-list admirers, these were the architects of modern rock. And they were tipping their hats to the man who, once thought outdated, was now outpacing expectations. The I'm Nearly Famous album wasn't just a comeback vehicle, it was a critical statement. The production was sleek, modern, and confident. Songs like Miss You Nights and I Can't Ask for Any More Than You showed an emotional range that critics had never given Cliff credit for. These weren't safe, shallow pop songs. They were adult, complex, and aching with honesty. And this wasn't a fluke. In the years that followed, Cliff kept climbing. He wasn't chasing trends, he was absorbing them, adapting them to his own sound. Greenlight, Carrie, Dreaming, all hits, all proof that Cliff was still a contender. But then, in 1979, came the knockout. We Don't Talk Anymore. It was smooth, slick, synth-infused, a breakup ballad wrapped in one of the most addictive hooks of the decade. Written by Alan Tarney, the song carried an emotional maturity that resonated with a whole new generation of listeners. The public couldn't get enough of it. The track went to #1 in the UK, his first since 1968. It hit #7 in the US, making it his biggest stateside hit ever. It topped charts across Europe and went on to sell over 5 million copies globally. For a moment, Cliff Richard was once again one of the most played voices in the world. But more importantly, he was finally respected. The critics who once dismissed him were rethinking their assumptions. He wasn't a novelty. He wasn't just the nice guy with the guitar. He was a serious artist with a career that had already spanned over 2 decades, and now looked ready to run into a third. By 1980, Cliff wasn't a nostalgia act. He was a multi-generational phenomenon. Teenagers who had screamed for him in 1959 were now raising children who listened to We Don't Talk Anymore on the radio. And those children didn't hear an old pop star. They just heard a great song. Cliff's comeback wasn't loud. It wasn't controversial, but it was seismic. Because it proved something very few artists ever get to prove, that talent doesn't expire. And neither does authenticity. While trends burned hot and fast, Cliff Richard did something infinitely harder. He evolved, without ever becoming someone else. And in doing so, he pulled off the kind of return that even the loudest rebels of his generation had to respect. Cliff wasn't back. He had never truly left. On the morning of August 14, 2014, Cliff Richard was sitting in his home in the Algarve, Portugal. The sun was out. The sea breeze was gentle. For once, things were quiet, but that calm was shattered the moment he turned on the television. What he saw left him paralyzed. Live aerial footage from the BBC showed police officers entering his Berkshire apartment. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Cameras zoomed in on officers rifling through drawers, scanning walls, lifting up papers and personal items. The broadcast was calm, clinical, almost surgical in its delivery, like it was a scene from a drama. But to Cliff, watching alone from another country, it felt like a violation. Not just of privacy, but of everything he had ever worked to protect: his name, his home, his reputation. The raid had been arranged in secret. Even worse, it had been coordinated with the BBC. South Yorkshire police had tipped off journalists in advance, referring to the footage internally as the money shot. The BBC had even sent a helicopter to ensure they captured the moment from above. Cliff hadn't even been interviewed by police yet. No charges had been filed, no explanation had been given. But none of that mattered, because the cameras were rolling. The allegation that triggered the raid was vague and decades old. A man had come forward claiming that Cliff had assaulted him during a 1985 Billy Graham rally at Bramall Lane Stadium. He described a room, a moment, a feeling. But the details were inconsistent. The location he claimed the assault occurred in hadn't even existed at the time. The room was fiction. The dates didn't line up. And yet, this was enough to unleash a full-force media spectacle. The damage was instant and irreparable. Cliff's phone rang non-stop. His legal team scrambled for answers. The press ran stories that ranged from cautious to cruel. Overnight, he went from knighted pop icon to tabloid suspect. He hadn't been arrested. He hadn't even been questioned. But the headlines didn't wait for due process. They ran ahead with one thing only: implication. Behind the scenes, Cliff broke down. He later admitted that he cried in his kitchen, sinking to the floor, completely helpless. He developed shingles from the stress. He stopped eating, lost weight. He couldn't sleep. He stopped answering calls. He began to feel like his house, his sanctuary, was contaminated. The psychological toll wasn't a side effect, it was the main event. The investigation dragged on for 22 months, nearly 2 years of silence, of suspicion, of waiting for a system that had already failed him. During that time, Cliff could barely work. He postponed releases, canceled events. Friends and colleagues stood by him, but the public scrutiny was constant. Eventually, police announced that no charges would be filed. Not because there wasn't enough to convict, but because there was no evidence at all. The case was dropped, quietly, but the noise didn't stop, because by then, it wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about perception. A national broadcaster had invaded his home and dignity in real time. Millions had seen it, and not one person in power had stopped it from happening. Cliff's life wasn't just disrupted, it had been broadcast like entertainment. Worse still, in the middle of the investigation, the BBC submitted their raid footage for a Scoop of the Year award. As Cliff waited in legal limbo, journalists were patting themselves on the back for catching him at his most vulnerable. This wasn't just journalism gone too far. This was something else, something more inhumane. And though Cliff had spent decades proving his innocence in every area of his life, morally, musically, personally, suddenly, all that history meant nothing. He was no longer Cliff the icon. He was Cliff the accused. And in a single day, it nearly erased him. Cliff Richard had spent his entire adult life in the spotlight, but never like this. For nearly 2 years, the police investigation and the media spectacle that followed left him trapped in a surreal kind of exile. Publicly present, but emotionally erased. He wasn't found guilty of anything. He wasn't even charged. And yet, the assumption of guilt lingered like smoke that refused to clear. When the legal system finally admitted there was no case, there was no front-page apology, no televised retraction, just silence. But Cliff couldn't let it end there. He did what very few public figures ever managed to do. He fought back and won. In July 2018, Cliff Richard took the BBC to court for their role in orchestrating and broadcasting the live police raid on his home. The case wasn't just about protecting his name. It was about setting a precedent, about reminding the media and the public that fame does not cancel out the right to privacy. And in that courtroom, Cliff wasn't performing. He was testifying, clearly, vulnerably, often through tears. He described the helplessness of watching his home, his sanctuary, turned into a public crime scene. He described feeling as though he were being permanently stained by something that never happened. The court listened, and then it ruled in his favor. The judge declared that the BBC's decision to air the raid, especially in coordination with the police, was a serious invasion of privacy. The raid wasn't news, it was spectacle. Cliff was awarded £210,000 in damages, plus additional sums for aggravated harm and legal costs. The BBC ultimately paid out nearly £2 million after all was said and done. South Yorkshire Police paid him an additional £400,000 and issued a public apology. But it wasn't about the money, not for Cliff. It was about the wording. The damage had already been done, but what haunted him most was the subtle, lingering language from prosecutors, the phrase insufficient evidence. To the public, that still sounded like a possibility, a maybe, a shadow. What Cliff needed and never truly received from the legal system was the one sentence that would clear him completely. There was no evidence because nothing happened. Without that clarity, he knew some people would always wonder. Some would always raise an eyebrow, some would whisper behind closed doors. And no payout could buy that peace of mind back. In interviews following the case, Cliff spoke openly about the trauma. He described sleepless nights, panic attacks, a blackmail attempt from another man trying to exploit the raid for money. He said he would look at strangers on the street and wonder if they believed he was guilty. He couldn't trust the silence anymore. He wasn't angry in the explosive way people expect. He was wounded in a deeper, quieter way. The kind of pain that comes when your life's work, your name, and your soul have been placed on trial not by a court, but by a camera. Yes, Cliff Richard won. The court agreed he had been wronged, but by then the damage had calcified into memory. It was a victory, but it came too late. Too late to undo the broadcast, too late to stop the headlines, too late to unsee the footage of officers combing through his belongings while the BBC hovered above like a news-hungry vulture. And for Cliff, who had spent 60 years building a career on honesty, consistency, and faith, there was no satisfaction in proving what he had always known, that he had done nothing wrong. Because by the time the truth was legally affirmed, the suspicion had already traveled around the world. Faster, louder, and far more damaging. In the end, Cliff Richard didn't just win a court case. He survived something far more dangerous, a world that no longer waits for justice before passing judgment. Today, Cliff Richard is 80+ years old. He's released over 100 singles, had 14 #1 hits, and sold more than 250 million records. He's the only UK artist with #1 hits in 5 consecutive decades. But beyond the stats, beyond the sales, there's something deeper. This is a man who lost the love of his life before he ever had her, who watched his name dragged through the mud for crimes he never committed, who lived with pain and chose music anyway. Cliff Richard never got married, but maybe his deepest commitment was to something else entirely. To love, to belief, to resilience, and to one unshakable truth. He never stopped singing. If Cliff's story made you feel something, whether it was anger, admiration, or just a deeper understanding, share it in the comments. We want to hear what stayed with you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told with care and honesty, hit that subscribe button. There's more to come.